She thought she was just charging her phone, but what happened next turned her daily habit into a stinky disaster she'll never forget. In suburban neighborhoods, the dynamics between neighbors often shift from cordial interactions to an unwritten set of expectations. People tend to have a certain understanding of what is acceptable and what isn't, based on their proximity and communal nature. The idea of borrowing or sharing resources, whether intentionally or casually, is common, especially when one doesn't want to feel like a burden or impose on others. For most, offering a simple favor is an act of goodwill. However, when the boundaries of personal space, resources, and responsibility become blurred, what was once a seemingly harmless gesture could lead to unintended consequences. One of the more subtle and less noticed conveniences that people often take for granted is the access to power. In many homes, outlets are scattered all over, often without much thought put into where they lead or how they're used. Most people assume that when they plug into an outdoor socket, it's simply part of the larger home electrical system, connected directly to the grid. For many, an outdoor outlet is seen as just another extension of the home's power, available for easy use whenever necessary. However, not all outlets are what they seem. Some have specific, perhaps even hidden, functions that serve very particular purposes. In the case of my home, my outdoor outlet was not just another socket, it was an essential part of the septic system. The purpose of this outlet, unbeknownst to anyone except myself, was to connect directly to the septic tank, which housed a critical pump used to regulate and manage waste. This pump helped keep the septic system operational, ensuring that it could move waste through pipes and into the treatment tank. While most homeowners would never even consider the possibility of an outlet linked to a waste management system, this setup was carefully planned and installed to meet the specific needs of my property. The septic system wasn't something that came to mind in daily routines. It was a feature of the house that remained quietly hidden behind the scenes, functioning without being noticed. People didn't think about the tanks, the pumps, or the intricate systems working below ground to keep the home's plumbing running smoothly. It was just one of those things people didn't need to be concerned about until something went wrong. Karen, as part of the Homeowners Association, HOA, had a reputation for being the self-appointed enforcer of community rules and boundaries. She was the type who took her position seriously, often stepping beyond the usual responsibilities of an HOA member, acting as if she had the authority to monitor, control, and even regulate the lives of those around her. While her intentions were arguably rooted in a desire for order and structure, her methods and the overreach of her influence left much to be desired. This was where our paths crossed. Karen was the kind of person who rarely asked for anything directly, but somehow found a way to make it clear that something needed to be done. It wasn't uncommon for her to pop by the neighborhood, checking on various homes to ensure everything was up to her standards. While she didn't outright demand much from others, she had a knack for subtly making her expectations known. In her frequent visits to the neighborhood, Karen began noticing the outdoor outlet on my property. It seemed like the perfect, easy-to-use power source, open and available, ready to be tapped into whenever she needed it. What Karen didn't know was that this particular outlet was not for typical household use. It was part of a carefully integrated system for managing waste. The outlet was connected to the septic tank pump, which required specific and minimal energy for its operation. If the outlet were to be overused, there was a risk of overloading the septic system's delicate balance. At first, Karen's behavior didn't seem like an issue. The outlet was conveniently placed, making it an easy choice for her to plug in her phone, charge her laptop, or power various gadgets. She might not have realized it, but every time she used the outlet, the pump was being activated. This wasn't the same as plugging into a grid-powered socket that could handle continuous and high-demand usage. This particular outlet had a more delicate function. It was not intended to power household electronics or devices, especially not on a daily basis. It's important to note that a typical septic system pump is not designed to be constantly running at high capacity. These systems are built to handle specific tasks in intervals, not to run continuously without giving the pump a break. However, Karen's regular use of the outlet was beginning to impact the system. While it was still manageable at first, it was the frequency and duration of use that started to create an unnoticed strain on the septic tank's operation. Each time Karen plugged into the outlet, she unknowingly triggered the pump, forcing it to work harder than it had been designed. To this daily habit of Karen's, what she likely considered a minor favor, was beginning to put a hidden system under stress. The septic tank, which had been quietly working in the background, maintaining a delicate balance of waste management, was now being subjected to increased demands. Yet despite this, nothing immediately seemed out of the ordinary. The system still functioned, albeit in a less efficient manner. It was only when the strain built up over time that the full effect of Karen's actions would become apparent. Had Karen been aware of the septic system's involvement, she might have been more cautious. But like most people, she was oblivious to the complexities that lay behind the house's systems. She never questioned why the outlet was placed in such an odd spot or why it appeared to be an afterthought in the design of the property. It simply served its purpose, and she used it without hesitation, unaware that she was unknowingly contributing to an impending disaster. As time went on, Karen's routine continued. It became a pattern she likely never thought twice about, and for a while, nothing seemed out of place. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the silent consequences of her actions began to build, leading to a situation no one could have predicted. The connection that had gone unnoticed for so long was about to reveal its full impact. At first, the situation seemed harmless, even trivial. A simple favor to a neighbor, providing access to an outlet that could help her with her everyday tasks. There was no immediate harm in letting her plug in her phone, charge a laptop, or power her small gadgets. The outlet was conveniently located, and it appeared to be an unassuming feature of my home, so why not allow her to use it? After all, who could imagine that something as simple as an outdoor outlet could be connected to such a critical system within the house? It was easy to overlook the significance of the outlet when it was used so regularly. A few minutes here, a few hours there. Karen didn't seem to be using it for anything excessive or outside the bounds of what any other neighbor might need. She had a habit of plugging in almost every day, but it was easy to dismiss it as an innocent routine. On the surface, it appeared like a harmless request, but behind that seemingly mundane favor lay a system I had carefully set up for the specific and essential purpose of maintaining the home's waste management. The real nature of the outlet, however, was not immediately apparent. While Karen likely assumed it was just a regular outdoor socket meant to provide electricity for simple tasks, the outlet's actual purpose was far more specialized. It was directly linked to the septic system's pump, a crucial component for managing waste. The pump's job was to move wastewater through the plumbing system, keeping the waste treatment process running smoothly. It wasn't designed to be used as an everyday source of power, and its operation was finely tuned to meet the needs of the septic system. This setup had been put in place with careful consideration and a deep understanding of the home's needs. The septic tank and pump were designed to operate at specific intervals and under minimal strain. The idea was that the pump would work intermittently, responding to changes in the water level within the tank. It was not built to handle continuous demand, as doing so could lead to system inefficiencies or worse, failures. Every time Karen plugged her devices into the outlet, she was unknowingly triggering the pump, forcing it to operate more frequently than necessary. What Karen didn't realize was that the outlet wasn't simply drawing power from the house's main electrical system. Instead, it was powering a critical part of the home's waste management system, which had a set capacity that should not be exceeded. Every time she used the outlet, the pump engaged, drawing energy that it wasn't meant to use on such a regular basis. Initially, this may have seemed like a minor, inconsequential detail. A phone charger here, a laptop there. It all seemed so normal. But as the days and weeks went by, the cumulative effect of this seemingly innocent habit began to build. It was also easy to dismiss any potential concerns because everything appeared to function as expected at first. The outlet continued to provide power without issue, and the septic system didn't show any obvious signs of distress. The pump worked, the water moved, and everything seemed perfectly fine on the surface. But the reality was that the system was slowly being put under unnecessary pressure, and with every additional use of the outlet, the strain grew. This setup was designed to be low maintenance, but it required a certain level of attention to ensure that it didn't become overloaded. The septic tank and its pump were not meant to be used as a power source for daily tasks, and over time, they were starting to bear the burden of Karen's frequent use of the outlet. What should have been a one-off incidental task was becoming an ongoing demand on the system's limited capacity. As the days passed, I began to notice the subtle signs of strain, though they were easy to ignore at first. The pump, which should have been operating intermittently, was now running more frequently. While this might not have seemed like a major issue initially, it was a gradual shift that began to have more serious consequences. The septic tank's balance was slowly tipping and the pump was being pushed harder than it had been designed to handle. But despite these early signs, there was no immediate reason to worry. The system still appeared to be functioning, and Karen's use of the outlet seemed to go unnoticed by both of us. It was only a matter of time before the quiet, gradual impact of her daily plugging in would build up, leading to consequences that neither of us could have foreseen. This silent setup, which had gone unnoticed for so long, was slowly priming the septic system for failure. In hindsight, it's easy to see that the failure to recognize the outlet's true purpose was a crucial misstep. What was once viewed as a simple convenience for a neighbor soon became a source of tension, though no one could have predicted that at the time. In fact, the gradual impact of Karen's actions was not apparent to either of us until the system began to show clear signs of strain. The reality was that Karen's regular use of the outlet had set in motion a chain of events that would eventually spiral out of control. She had unknowingly triggered the very system that would soon cause the trouble neither of us could have anticipated. Over time, Karen's behavior began to develop into a consistent routine. It wasn't just a one-off occurrence anymore, it became a daily habit. Each morning, without fail, she would make her way over to the outdoor outlet. The small gesture of plugging in her phone, laptop, or other electronic devices seemed so ordinary, so commonplace that it barely registered as an issue, at least on the surface. To Karen, this outlet was simply a convenient, easily accessible source of power. It was there, sitting in the open, ready to serve her whenever she needed it. What she failed to notice, however, was that the outlet was far from ordinary. In the beginning, there was no reason for either of us to suspect that something was amiss. After all, the outlet was clearly part of the home's infrastructure, positioned conveniently enough on the outside of the house. But what Karen didn't realize was that this outlet wasn't just a passive power source. It was wired directly to a specialized system that was responsible for keeping the septic tank operational. This meant that every time she plugged in her devices, the septic pump was activated, drawing unnecessary power. Though the system was designed to manage such tasks, it was never intended for continuous use. The more Karen plugged in, the more stress she placed on the system. At first, this minor use of the outlet didn't seem significant. It was easy to overlook the implications of her actions, as they seemed so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. She was simply charging her phone, perhaps leaving it plugged in for a few hours while she went about her day. Sometimes it would be her laptop, other times a smaller gadget. But every day, she seemed to find something new to plug in. It was a routine she likely never thought twice about. She was simply utilizing the resources available to her in a way that seemed practical and harmless. Yet behind the convenience of plugging in a device, there was a growing issue beneath the surface. The septic system was not equipped to handle continuous daily use of the power source. The pump that was activated every time Karen used the outlet was designed to work intermittently, only when necessary to move waste through the system. The rest of the time, it was supposed to remain dormant, waiting for the right conditions to activate it again. By plugging in her devices every day, Karen was forcing the pump to work harder than it had been designed to. Even if the power demand wasn't particularly high, the pump was working on a daily basis, something it wasn't meant to do. In the context of the septic system, this was more than just a minor oversight. It was a growing imbalance. The pump's primary function was to handle specific, intermittent tasks, but Karen's habit of plugging in her devices day after day was turning a normally low-demand system into something that was constantly on the verge of overuse. It wasn't just one or two devices charging here and there. It was a repeated daily demand that gradually began to test the system's limits. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Karen's daily plug-ins became a part of her routine. She no longer gave it a second thought. The outlet had become a tool she relied on without question, as if it were just another part of the house. The very location of the outlet, tucked away outside and not in a place where anyone would typically question its function, made it easy for Karen to forget that it was connected to something much more critical than just an extension of the home's electricity. She saw it as a simple power source, a convenience to her busy lifestyle. But while Karen carried on with her daily use, the strain on the septic system was becoming more and more evident. The septic pump, which had once operated at a steady, intermittent pace, was now running almost constantly. Even small changes in the regularity of its operation began to add up, gradually wearing down the system that had been designed to operate under specific conditions. The once balanced and stable system now found itself pushed into overdrive. The issue wasn't necessarily about the volume of power being used. Rather, it was about the constant, consistent demands placed on a system that wasn't designed for such use. The septic pump was built to work only when absolutely necessary, responding to the water levels in the tank and then shutting off when its work was done. However, with each day that Karen plugged in her devices, the pump's cycles became more frequent, more prolonged, and more unpredictable. It was no longer an efficient or balanced process. It was a system being tested beyond its intended capacity. Even though the situation was slowly growing worse, it wasn't obvious at first. Karen had no reason to suspect that there was any issue, and the system seemed to continue functioning, at least at a basic level. The septic tank still moved waste through the pipes. The pump still did its job. But beneath the surface, small inefficiencies were starting to build. These inefficiencies were like small cracks in the foundation, nothing overtly visible, but enough to slowly destabilize the balance of the entire system. It's easy to imagine how Karen might have rationalized her behavior. After all, what harm was there in charging her phone for a few hours each day? The outlet was just there, sitting innocently, waiting to be used. And so, without any second thoughts, she continued her daily routine, plugging in her devices without even considering the long-term consequences of her actions. What she couldn't see was that her seemingly harmless habit was, in fact, pushing the septic system closer to a breaking point. This daily use, at first unremarkable and seemingly insignificant, was the tipping point. It wasn't a single event or a sudden failure, but a consistent cumulative impact over time. The more Karen used the outlet, the more it wore down the septic system's ability to function properly. What had started as a simple convenience was now becoming a strain. And before long, the consequences of those small daily actions would become impossible to ignore. Over time, the once reliable and steady operation of the septic system began to show signs of strain. It wasn't immediately apparent, as the system continued to function, at least superficially, as it always had. However, with every passing day and Karen's continued use of the outdoor outlet, the stress on the septic system grew. What had initially been a minor inconvenience, unnoticed by most, was slowly turning into a much larger problem. It was a problem that eventually would manifest in a catastrophic failure, a disaster that no one could have anticipated. Septic systems, while built to last, are finely balanced systems. They are designed to work under specific conditions, with intervals of operation that allow the system to rest and maintain its delicate equilibrium. The pump, which had originally been activated only when needed, was now running almost continuously, triggered by Karen's frequent use of the outlet. As the pump worked overtime, the waste levels in the tank continued to fluctuate, and the system was no longer functioning as intended. There was a tipping point where the balance could no longer be maintained, and this would eventually lead to the system's failure. The first sign of trouble came when a strange odor began to linger in the yard. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it quickly became impossible to ignore. The smell was unmistakable, an unpleasant, foul odor that could only be attributed to a septic issue. Initially, I dismissed it as nothing more than a minor inconvenience, thinking perhaps the system had simply been pushed a little too hard. However, as the days went by, the odor grew stronger, more pungent. The scent became increasingly unbearable, permeating the yard and drifting toward the house. It was then that the full extent of the problem became evident. The septic tank, which had been functioning steadily in the background for years, was now overwhelmed. The pump, which had been activated repeatedly due to Karen's daily use of the outlet, could no longer keep up with the increased demand. The waste levels in the tank were rising too quickly, and the system, unable to process it all efficiently, began to back up. The clogging of the pipes and the overflowing of waste from the tank were the telltale signs that the system had failed. The consequences of this overload were immediate and severe. As the septic system struggled to handle the growing volume of waste, the tank began to back up into the yard. What had once been a quiet, out-of-sight system that functioned without issue was now a source of chaos and mess. The overflow of waste spilled over the edges of the tank, seeping into the yard, and creating a hazardous, unsanitary situation. The area around the septic tank became a contaminated swamp, with the excess waste making its way to the surface and spreading across the ground. To make matters worse, the overflow of waste occurred right in front of Karen's parked car. This was not just an inconvenience, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The car, which had been parked conveniently near the septic tank's location, now found itself directly in the path of the spillage. The yard, once pristine and well-kept, was now tainted by the mess. The smell was unbearable. The yard was now contaminated, and there was no quick fix for the situation. What had seemed like an innocent and minor problem was now a full-blown disaster, with the consequences of Karen's daily use of the outlet playing a pivotal role in the breakdown of the septic system. The damage wasn't just to the yard or the septic tank. It was to the entire surrounding area. The waste overflowed in all directions, leaving unsightly puddles of sewage throughout the yard. The smell, which had been gradually intensifying, was now a constant presence in the air, making it nearly impossible to spend any time outdoors without feeling the effects. The lawn was soaked with sewage, and areas of the garden were ruined. The very system that had once kept everything running smoothly had now become a source of frustration, chaos, and, most significantly, embarrassment. The situation was dire, and it wasn't something that could be easily fixed. Septic tank overflows are not only inconvenient but are also costly to repair. The damage to the surrounding property was not something that could be rectified with a simple fix. The septic tank needed to be pumped and cleaned, the pipes flushed, and the entire system thoroughly inspected to ensure that it was functioning properly again. The costs associated with these repairs were significant, and they would ultimately need to be covered, either through the homeowner's insurance or out of pocket. Either way, it was a financial burden that could have been avoided had Karen been more mindful of the power she was drawing from the outdoor outlet. By now, it had become clear that the daily plug-ins had pushed the septic system past its limits. What started as a minor issue, a simple, regular use of an outdoor outlet, had grown into a full-scale disaster. The overuse of the septic pump had caused the system to fail in the worst possible way, and now the consequences were impossible to ignore. The overflowing septic tank, the contaminated yard, and the persistent odor were all direct results of Karen's continued use of the outlet. As the situation unfolded, it became obvious that this failure was not just a random malfunction. It was the cumulative result of weeks, if not months, of repeated, unconsidered actions. Every time Karen plugged in her devices, she unknowingly added to the strain on the system. What had seemed like a small, everyday task had now led to a significant issue that would require time, money, and effort to resolve. The overflow disaster was the inevitable result of Karen's disregard for the true purpose of the outdoor outlet. It was a stark reminder that even the smallest actions, when done repeatedly, can have far-reaching consequences. What had once been a simple favor, a neighborly act, had now turned into a monumental headache, one that no one could have predicted at the start. The aftermath of the septic system's failure was not only a major inconvenience, but a clear indication of the consequences that come with disregarding boundaries. The entire situation could have been avoided if Karen had simply been more considerate about the use of the outlet. What had begun as a small, seemingly harmless request, plugging in a phone or laptop to charge, had spiraled into a disaster. That was impossible to ignore. The effects of the overflow were not just physical, but also a harsh reminder of the importance of understanding the unseen complexities in everyday systems. When the septic system failed, the problem wasn't confined to the yard alone. The overflow was the most visible consequence, but the damage extended further. It took days to begin addressing the immediate mess. The smell lingered in the air, and the once neat garden was now a contaminated area. There was a noticeable loss of property value, not to mention the immediate financial burden of repairing the septic tank and cleaning up the mess. It was a chaotic and embarrassing situation, one that no homeowner wants to deal with, especially not because of something as seemingly trivial as an outdoor outlet being overused. This was when the true cost of Karen's daily routine became apparent. She had unknowingly triggered the issue with her repeated plug-ins, unaware of the strain she was putting on a system that wasn't designed to be used in that manner. For her, the situation seemed trivial. Charging her devices was a simple task, and she was so accustomed to doing it without thinking. But in reality, her actions had caused a major problem. It was one of those instances where the smallest of actions had larger consequences, and in the process, Karen's behavior had disrupted the delicate balance of my home's plumbing system. Despite the significant damage, there was something poetic about the irony of the situation. The constant use of the outlet, which Karen had taken for granted, had been the very thing that led to her downfall. Her reliance on the outlet, something she had assumed would always be there, something she thought was inconsequential, was the reason the septic tank had been pushed beyond its limits. The disaster, though an unfortunate one, was an opportunity for a bit of sweet revenge. It wasn't just about the damage to the property. It was about the lesson that Karen had failed to learn, the lesson of respect and boundaries. It was clear that Karen had no idea the outlet was connected to such an essential and delicate system. If she had known, she likely wouldn't have used it as frequently, understanding that it served a critical function. But she didn't know, and that ignorance only made the situation worse. She had assumed that her small daily actions, plugging in her devices, were harmless. The fact that she didn't even realize the outlet was part of a more complex system, a system designed to manage waste and regulate the home's plumbing, showed just how little she understood about the impact of her actions. The true beauty of the situation lay in the fact that Karen's routine, which she had believed was harmless, had turned into a moment of reckoning. The very thing she relied on for convenience, the outlet, was now unavailable to her. Once the system had failed, the outlet was disconnected. It was no longer an option for her to plug in her devices. The simple, everyday task that she had grown accustomed to was no longer possible, and it was all because of her disregard for the boundaries of the system she was interacting with. This wasn't just about making sure the outlet was no longer available for her use. It was about the lesson that came with the failure, the chaos, the mess, the financial cost. It all served as a reminder that there are consequences to every action, no matter how small it may seem at the time. Karen had violated an unspoken understanding of the boundaries of what was acceptable. By ignoring the system's purpose and misusing the outlet, she had inadvertently caused harm. The disaster, while unfortunate, served as a valuable lesson, one that Karen would not forget anytime soon. Beyond the immediate financial and practical implications of the septic system failure, the situation also provided an opportunity to reinforce the importance of boundaries and personal responsibility. It was easy for Karen to assume that she could take advantage of the outlet without consequence, but the reality was that her actions had a ripple effect. Those small, seemingly innocent decisions, the daily use of the outlet, had caused a large-scale issue. The repair costs, the inconvenience, the unpleasant smell, all of it was the price paid for her disregard. The revenge wasn't just about making sure the outlet was unavailable. It was about highlighting the point that actions have consequences. Karen, who had initially taken the outlet for granted, would no longer be able to rely on it. But more importantly, she would likely think twice before assuming she could take advantage of other people's resources again. What started as a simple daily routine had turned into a moment of revelation. Karen had unknowingly tested the limits of the system, and in the process, she had pushed it too far. At the end of it all, the lesson wasn't just about the septic tank and the outlet. It was about the importance of understanding the systems we rely on and respecting the boundaries that exist, even if they aren't immediately visible. The sweet revenge wasn't about causing harm or embarrassment. It was about teaching a valuable lesson in responsibility and awareness. And while the damage to the septic system was significant, the real takeaway was far more profound: respect. For boundaries is essential, whether it's in personal relationships, shared resources, or systems that keep our lives running smoothly. Subscribe to the HOA Stories for more shocking tales of neighborly drama and unexpected twists.